Good afternoon. It's a real pleasure to be with you here today, although I actually can't see any of you, but I know you're out there. I'm going to talk today about, and given this is the kind of pre-lunch slot, about a contentious issue, because the world around arts is starting to think about the question of what data analytics means for us, but that meaning is going to present a challenge to diversity. I hadn't started to think about that, I will be honest with you, until I was asked to speak here today. And I planned a talk that was all about the brilliant unification that, and help that data analytics could bring to this brilliant and important area. But as I thought about it, I said, I realized that we had a problem. Data is not a solution to diversity, but it is a challenge to it. And what I want to explore today with you is six aspects of the type of thinking that this world we call big data brings. As it starts to impact on the arts, and as that impact starts to grow, it's going to, one way or another, in ways that I won't try and predict, change what diversity means. And all of our job, as we start to address that change, is working out what to do about it. Stephanie's already just quickly introduced me, but to give you a sense of background, I came into the museum sector nearly 4 years ago now, and was very lucky in a way that the very first conversation I had with anyone really about what museums meant was with Neil McGregor, my old boss at the British Museum. I asked him then, what do you want me to do? Do you want me to make more money, or do you want me to build an audience? And Neil, in his very kind of brilliant way, said simply, do both. That doing of both is a constant challenge in the history of arts across this country and across the world. But it's a challenge that, again, is going to change as we think around data, understand data better, and understand what it means and can do for us. I work now at the National Gallery, where I'm very, very privileged to set up now for the second time in this sector a function that looks at data, audience insight, and analytics. But I want to explain today, really, I said, what does big data do? What does the type of thinking that go around it mean? And what is it going to do to the arts and cultural world as it starts to penetrate what we do? I was lucky to learn from a brilliant guy who'd made literally hundreds of millions of pounds from kind of gaming startups about this world of data analytics about 6 or 7 years ago. And very simply, thinking about data analytics means thinking from very extreme global scales on a level of globality really very few other types of enterprise have ever dealt with, down to extreme, precise targeting of individuals. That movement from the universal to the personal is something really the digital universe has learnt to unpack and is learning to unpack every day, but it comes loaded with dangers. One very critical thing to say is in all the conversations over the last decade I've ever had about data analytics, not a single one of them, with any organisation really around the world, has ever talked about the question of diversity. And as I came to that, I thought about that in the preparation for today, that's where I realised where the problem's going to come from. Because this very global scale thing that we call the internet and all the businesses that are powering it don't think about these questions. And they're creating tools, creating methods, creating ways of seeing the world and ways that are now powering the world that don't think about the challenges of diversity underneath it. And that's the problem that we're going to have to solve in the months and years ahead. There's a very simple reason for that, is that the world that big data is making is not about diversity. It's about money, it's about marketing, and it's about influence and power. And sometimes in the worlds of arts and culture, that's important and a good thing. But clearly sometimes it isn't. And again, how these two things bash into each other, how they make sense of each other, and how we make sense of them is a huge challenge for us as the years ahead. Because make no mistake, the arts and culture world is at the beginning of changes brought on by big data, by analytics, and the things that it does that we are at the start of, but we are by no means at the conclusion of. I want to think and talk you through some concepts that you think about when you think about big data analytics, and just very briefly tease how they will bash into some of the questions of diversity that we think about. What's interesting about the great technology companies in the world is in some ways they think from a very similar point of view to how museums started to think 250 years ago. If you hear Neil McGregor talk about what museums are, it's about being these places for everybody. Now, sometimes they do that well and sometimes they do that very badly. But if you hear Mark Zuckerberg, who runs Facebook, Jeff Bezos, who runs Amazon, talk about what their organizations do, they also see themselves as organizations for everyone. Mark Zuckerberg's mission for Facebook, connecting the whole world together. The idea of Amazon, the everything shop that sells everything to everybody wherever they are. These universalist concepts sit very much at the heart of what technology businesses mean. But for them, they make no differentiation about the type of people that sits within that universal audience group. It is just everyone, held together in a big anonymized mass. And whenever you start thinking about data analytics, that is where you start, from this big anonymous mass of people that could be everyone in the whole world. And that is a challenge in a world where we want to understand different audiences better and help to make sure that all of their needs are served. So these two things fundamentally might bash into each other, might cause problems to one another, and do things that we have to think about as we go forward. The second question of that is, well, when you have this huge audience of everyone, what do you do about it? What you do in the world of data analytics is you split it up into bits, not determined by identity, not determined by who people are, but determined simply by the time you start looking at them. We call these cohorts. You take a bunch of people who use your website. You say, well, everyone who uses my website between Monday the 15th, Friday the 19th, becomes my first cohort. And again, I understand them as an anonymous mass more than I understand them as anything else. And I look and observe their behavior over a period of time. And no bit within that has privilege. The bit that does become privileged, and again, this is where we start to see the underlying tension about where big data comes from, is that it's ultimately the people who spend, the people who transact with you, who emerge out that mass to become the privileged audience. And again, in a world of arts and culture where, again, to take Neil's words, we're both building audience and making money at the same time, at the first point you make a choice when you think about data analytics between which audience is more important than the other, you will make a choice that says the audience that transacts with me, the audience that spends. And that is a problem we're going to have to think about. The third bit thinks about behavioral segments. I'll talk a little bit later about the things I find peculiar in arts marketing when we think about motivations as a cause for our marketing. But when you think again from a data analytics point of view, you think about behavioral segments. What is that audience trying to do? It is a discipline built on actions, not a discipline built on identities. And that actions, again, are easier to define, easier to understand, where our action becomes, this person is trying to buy a ticket. This person is trying to download a resource from my website. Because those are tangible things that I can hold on and say, they have done that, even and mostly because I don't know really who they are. And so this question of behavioral segmentation is absolutely at the heart of what data analytics thinking means. And again, it bashes into these notions of trying to understand audiences and trying to look at some of the promotion of some of them, not by behavior, but by identity. The next one, and we get to start to see now the challenges of the world we live in, is that after you get past anonymous groups, you go straight to the individual from there. Digital may not be a great thing for society and for community because it goes, as I said, from anonymous groups to single individuals very, very quickly. Because the bit between those, societies, communities, things that hold people together by common cultural concern, are extremely hard to think about and measure, whereas individual behaviours and the behaviour of anonymous groups is very easy to measure. And so when you come past those anonymous sectors, you come to the individual and you start to think, what can I do to and with them? And you want to get that name in your database. And you want to understand from that database, how can I make more money from that person? And that's a tension all of you in arts organisations around the country get to. You want now, in a world of GDPR, to have well-managed databases, people coming together in there. And what will you want to do with them ultimately? You want them to get more things with you. And when you come to your measures of success, you will come back to that question. How can I make more money from these people? And that is, again, is the world that data analytics has created, because it can't think very acutely about the bit between everybody and the individual. As we go past the question of the individual, we start to come to the difficult things that we are seeing in the social environment around us that happen because I can understand individuals and because I can understand anonymous masses in such detail. Over the last year, we have seen what this idea of micro-targeting in advertising can start to do to a world, and how understanding people by parameters, 30, 50, 100 different specific behaviours that they might be prone to, can lead to a world where Donald Trump can become president. Can lead to Brexit one way or another, because the things a company like Cambridge Analytica, a very, very interesting but very complicated advertising business, can do when they break people down into 50 or 60 chunks and say, if we just take that 100,000 people, understand them in great detail, and bash them with advertising 20 times a day on Facebook and everywhere they go, we might be able to influence and change the behaviours they have. And again, we're moving ever more in that, not to understanding society, but to understanding a small portion of individuals within it that we can change through advertising. And that, again, is a challenge for the years ahead, because very simply, power and influence has understood that first, before the rest of us who have more noble aspirations for society have even got close to it. And we have to think about these things. I went to a brilliant talk by a Guardian journalist last year who said, micro-targeting advertising is destroying democracy. I don't know if that's true or not, but certainly some anti-democratic forces got there before pro-democratic forces did. And all the values that we might aspire to become challenged from this kind of behaviour. And the next one, ultimately, is about where we've now ended up in a world where the internet has shaped people around identity rather than around questions of diversity. We are seeing very painfully out in society now, particularly through Twitter, but really through the wider forces that sit around it, the kind of coalescence into binary identities between one thing versus another. It's remain versus leave. It's, to use the words of the terrible commentator Katie Hopkins, Londonistan versus the rest of the UK. It's this whole series of kind of social media and data-created things that sit against each other as binaries that people cling to and say, this is me, but it's not me. It's nothing to do with me, but they allow me to hold in a group together, and a group of outrage based on Twitter feeds particularly, that makes things harder to do. And we have to see these as challenges to the promotion of diversity, because people are choosing to let themselves be much simpler human beings in a very narrow digital media universe. And so I want to say to you all today, because you will solve the problems of diversity in the arts much better than I will, is that these things, as we let them into the arts institutes we have, will cause problems for us with the diversity strategies that we want to promote. But I think we have to do it, because there are so many other problems around what we're trying to do in arts and culture, around sustainability, around fiscal viability, that only big data and analytics is going to help. I have heard in very numerous contexts over the last 3 or 4 years, as someone who promotes this way of thinking very strongly, that somehow maybe we shouldn't let this into what we do. If we don't let it into what we do, we're never going to have the chance for the economic improvement, and particularly fiscal improvement, that big data and analytics can lead to. And so I want to flip away from the questions of what it's doing to the question of diversity to just show what it might actually be doing on the other side around the question of how we think about marketing. Marketing, I think, is one of the really broken things in the arts and culture sector. And I don't just mean marketing campaigns. I mean the whole question of how we talk to the public about the things we do and get the public to engage with us. And data and analytics is one of the things that can help us most there. So while on one side, we clearly need to think very deeply about what this means to diversity, in a world of ever more complex financial situations, an ever more complex opportunity around marketing, we have to start to understand this better and do more in this type of thinking to help promote and sustain the institutions and organisations that we run. Because on one side, universal audiences stops these complex questions of target audiences. I have seen too many PowerPoint presentations over the last 4 years that said our target audience is young people, old people, and people in between. That is not helpful. That just means everybody. But only if you fully acknowledge everybody and don't start thinking like that can you really start to move forward, understand what the data is telling you, and do something better about it than just acknowledging you want to reach everybody with everything. The same with this question of anonymous cohorts. The arts world has thought about audience development, trying to bring different audiences in different ways. But until we start to understand audiences as behaviours, built around particular behaviours over periods of time, we will struggle to really get traction in a digital universe. And the same question will come around behavioural segments and motivations. I will say to you honestly, I don't really believe that we can prove the benefit and power of motivations as a principle of segmentation in the work that we do. But every single thing I do, I can prove through behavioural segmentation that this audience wants to do that with me, and can I do it better or worse than I did before? And narrowing the field and range of what we try to do with audiences in that context will help us do things better, cheaper, faster, and more effectively. And we have to do that. Simply the same way, also the question of personalisation. Every single person who walks into this brilliant theatre here is ultimately an individual. And the individualisation of experience is a critical thread of the years ahead. Every brilliant presentation I've ever seen about the potential of digital in a museum ultimately comes to this point where I'll be walking through the Louvre or walking through the Met, and the object that is most meaningful to me will be the one that someone wants to show me next. That dream is still just a dream for museums, as it is for most of the arts and cultural disciplines that we work in. But this sense that there is ultimately an experience which is unique to one person will go beyond what we can do when we start to talk to groups of people altogether, and will be one of the things that comes, again, as real, deep, great opportunity in the years ahead. And ultimately, we need, as we think really hard about what marketing means for this area, microtargeting, as vicious as its initial effects on society have been, will help us get away from this notion of big marketing campaigns in the arts. As someone who's worked in corporate media, I can promise you no one in the arts in this country has ever done a big marketing campaign. A big marketing campaign starts with a budget of £10 million. None of us will ever have a budget of £10 million, and it starts with a budget of £10 million because it takes £10 million to influence people to change. You need to see that advert, if you're doing traditional outdoor media or TV or whatever it is, so many times for it to influence you that we will never even get on the same bus as these guys to get towards that point. But with microtargeting, we could find the 300 people who would sit in this theatre and find the things about them that define who they are, that make them want to come to a play here. I'm assuming Cinderella is a more broad-based audience. There's some of the things that Stephanie will want to show here, but to find the things that we want to show here. And we could advertise just them relentlessly to get them to buy tickets here, which is a value transaction which is useful and meaningful to both sides of the audience. It defines an audience who actually want what we want, rather than just people who happen to be passing by. And it helps us define, from our side, a pot of spend, a potential of influence and value of influence that is useful to us. And ultimately, that idea of micro-targeting, I said, as malicious as its initial influences have been, is a very potent thing when we start to think about people and what they mean. Because ultimately, while we live in a society that's at the moment fragmented around particular notions of identity, micro-targeting personalization leads to a world where we can stop worrying about identity and start worrying about identities. Because what micro-targeting realizes that we're struggling with elsewhere in our cultural dialogue is that people aren't defined by one single thing. People are defined by 40, 50, 60 different things that make up who they are. And it's the combination of those things that makes the human being, not the fact that they're white, not the fact that they're black, not the fact that they are young or old or anywhere in between. It is the combination of identities. Me as father, me as Arsenal fan, as miserable as an experience as that is, the combination of things coming together that defines the human being. And if we as arts organisations can speak to complex, rich human beings defined by complex, rich identities, we have a much more potent future ahead of us where we can speak to people in honest dialogue about the things that we want and the things that they do. And so I just want to end simply with two simple quotes to sum that up, because I said, I think we are at a time of challenge now, a very deep and rich challenge that we have to take on. But I think alongside that challenge comes a great opportunity. And the great thinker Amartya Sen, who I've been privileged enough when he was a trustee of the British Museum to present to twice, and both times he's fallen asleep, says in his brilliant book, The Idea of Justice, the identity of an individual is essentially a function of her choices rather than the discovery of an immutable attribute. That is something innately that the world of big data and analytics recognizes. The people are not defined by one thing, they're defined by many things. And even better than Amartya Sen, back in the 19th century, the great American poet Walt Whitman says, "And what I assume you shall assume, for every atom belonging to me as good as belongs to you." And that atomization that big mass of stuff that defines who we are, is the world that big data analytics gives us access to. And if we take it with the seriousness it deserves, it can help us reshape the arts for a more viable and meaningful future. Thank you.